Now I'm going to introduce Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. He's Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, USA, as I said earlier. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Malawi, his master's degree from the University of London, and his PhD from Dalhousie University in Canada. A transdisciplinary scholar, his work covers a wide range of fields, including African economic history, development studies, intellectual history, diaspora studies, gender studies, human rights studies, cultural studies, and literary studies. Professor Zeleza is a highly accomplished scholar and academic administrator who has held several distinguished positions in universities in Canada, the United States, and Africa. Prior to his current position, he was Vice Chancellor, President, and Professor of Social Sciences and Humanities at the United States International University in Nairobi. So you can imagine Paul and I were talking about the trials and tribulations of being a Vice Chancellor every day. Then one day, we're talking nicely and I say, Paul is always on the other one. My brother, I want to tell you something. It is not official yet, but I'll be leaving my position. Said Professor should delete his number. The guy is no longer in the same WhatsApp group. He's widely published and has authored and edited 27 books, and several have won international awards. One of them is his latest is this particular one. And this Paul produced this book while we were, in the same WhatsApp group as vice presidents and all of that. So the book is called Africa and the Disruptions of the 21st Century. As if that was not enough for Paul to be working on this and our headaches. So Paul, what does Paul do? He sends me the manuscript. Please, my brother, read and send your comments. Plus, when you finish, write a blurb. So you will see at the back there, I had to write something as well. And Paul knew I was still working on budgets and all of that thing. So Re-envisioning Africa and the American Universities for Publication is another book that is going to publish this year. He hasn't bothered me for a blurb yet, but I'm not sleeping well because I know it's coming. And the Chronicles of African University Leaders, a volume of reflections by former vice chancellors of some of Africa's leading universities, to be published next year. I should perhaps not become a vice chancellor quickly so I can have a chapter in there. Professor Zeleza has worked as a consultant for the Ford and MacArthur Foundations on their initiatives to revitalize higher education in Africa. And his research on the African academic diaspora led to the establishment of the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program 10 years ago in 2013, which has sponsored more than 600 African-born academics in the United States and Canada to work with universities in 9 African countries. If you like, this is a brilliant scheme to reverse the so-called brain drain, or to actually, in a sense, not see it just as a problem, but also as an opportunity. He has also raised tens of millions of dollars for institutional advancement and research. I would now call upon Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza to deliver his response. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the first Future Africa Global Lecture. Paul is a historian and you are witness to history.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon to those who are participating virtually. I wish to begin by thanking my brother for those very kind remarks. This has been one of the most impressive and delightful conferences I've attended in a while, and therefore, initially I said to myself, there is nothing really I can add to it. In fact, I told several people that one of my experiences in Kenya was that when it came to your turn to talk and you have nothing to add, you simply say, I concur. And I was tempted to say, I concur with everything that has been said over the last 2 days, and therefore, let's go and party. But I thought that would not justify the cost of the ticket coming here. And also, certainly, that given the importance of today being the 60th anniversary of Africa Day, I better say something. And it also happens to be my birthday. Africa and the world find themselves at a dizzying crossroads, characterized by massive, messy, complex, and contradictory developments and disruptions. Nothing seems immune to the accelerated march into the economic, political, geopolitical, social, cultural, technological, and ecological transformations of the 21st century. This represents simultaneously a reckoning with the systemic deformities and inequities of the 20th century and the tantalizing aspirations of masses of people for a more livable, equitable, humane, and sustainable world in the unfolding century. Higher education institutions are deeply impacted and imbricated in the construction of the contemporary world in all its complicated and tumultuous dynamics. These are the two sets of issues in my presentation. I begin by offering a brief and broad outline of what I consider as the key forces that will structure the 21st century, in which Africa must become a player, not a pawn, if it is to ever realize its long-deferred Pan-Africanist dreams. The visions of the Africa we want must be placed in the maelstrom of these global developments. Universities have a profound role to play in developing the capacities and imaginations for Africa's future, which constitutes the second part of my presentation. The two sections are derived from my recent two book projects. One titled The Long Transition to the 21st Century, A Global History of the Present, which I'm currently writing, and the other titled Re-envisioning the African and American Academies, that was just completed and will be published later this year. The long transition to the 21st century. African visions of the future abound, currently embodied in the African Union's Agenda 2063 and a plethora of regional and national aspirations. Globally, they are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They all evoke the enduring triple dreams of African nationalism for self-determination, development, and democracy. The protracted struggles to realize these visions are tied to the unyielding demands of the infinitely complex and rapidly changing world system. As we prognosticate Africa's trajectories in the 21st century, we must untangle the deep forces that are restructuring the world and develop effective strategies to navigate them to Africa's advantage, a task that is the primary province of universities, think tanks, and policymakers. Historically, the continent and its peoples have always been central to the histories of humanity and our planet. The modern world is inconceivable in all its dimensions: economic, political, cultural, demographic, and epistemic, without the massive contributions of Africans during the long, barbaric centuries of Atlantic slavery and colonialism, whose benefits were reaped by the metropoles of Euro-America. Everything must be done to avoid such a fate as the 21st century unfolds. In the long transition to the 21st century, I identify 5 major forces along which the world is likely to spin. What I term, first, the rise of the people; second, the emergence of planetary consciousness; third, the digitalization of everything; fourth, the great demographic reshuffle; and fifth, the restructuring of the geopolitical order. By the rise of the people, I refer to the growth of social movements and struggles for emancipation, empowerment, and the development of political regimes about the politics of mass mobilization in defiance or defense of the prevailing political order, in pursuit of the interests of ordinary people or the elites, and the expansion and contraction of participatory spaces for the marginalized and their deployment in factional struggles for power by fractions of the political class. Since World War II, the world has been characterized by 3 major political developments. First, the growth of powerful social movements coalesced around struggles for decolonization, civil rights, women's rights, and environmental rights, among others. Second, the contestations between neo-imperialism, democracy, and autocracy. Third, the rise of populisms, what I often refer to as the globalization of tribalism. Overall, the decolonization of Africa and Asia after World War II represented the most significant political development of the 20th century and one of the most powerful waves of democratization in world history. At the turn of the 21st century, the world was transfixed and transformed by struggles for democratization, resulting in the so-called third wave of democracy. Each region had its own constellation of social movements, political dynamics, and epicenters that crisscrossed in complex and contradictory ways with others across the world. Before long, democracy atrophied in many of the post-independent states as autocratic regimes emerged, only for democratic struggles to resume from the 1980s. However, from the 2010s, democratic recessions accelerated globally as authoritarian populisms spread, although mass support for democracy remained high. For post-colonial Africa, the struggles for the second independence in the 1980s and 1990s were fueled by the abortion of the independence social contract under the draconian structural adjustment programs, SAPs, that were imposed with reactionary fundamentalist zeal by the international financial institutions with the connivance of Africa's crass, corrupt, and unpatriotic ruling elites. The African transitions to democracy were quite varied and characterized by progress, blockages, and reversals. In many countries, the wily political classes soon learned to manipulate the new electoral politics through the mobilization of the sectarian identities of ethnicity, religion, and region, and in some repressive regimes re-emerged. But the fires of popular revolt against tyranny and for social justice endured and continued to erupt from time to time. By the emergence of planetary consciousness, I refer to the intensifying circuits of human connectedness, communication, and awareness, thanks to the time-space compressive propensities of globalization and digitalization. The world has undergone different phases of globalization, during which flows of all manner of human artifacts have accelerated and intensified, from capital, commodities, and culture, to images, ideologies, and institutions, to values, viruses, and violence, and to people, plants, and pollutants. The rapidity with which the COVID-19 virus and its mutations spread from December 2019, when it was discovered in China, was staggering. The unconscionable global vaccine apartheid exposed by the pandemic was a wake-up call for Africa to establish more robust healthcare systems and vaccine manufacturing capacities, which requires synergistic partnerships between government, private firms, universities, and other research institutions. The Great Recession of 2008-2009 engendered widespread economic desolation, deepening inequalities, the decline of the middle classes, a rising sense of powerlessness and hopelessness among ordinary people, and raging popular distrust of elites and establishments. Although Africa fared slightly better than other regions due to the existence of large reserves relative to annual imports, reduction of dependence on aid with their punishing conditionalities, and reliance on remittances and FDI, diversification of export markets from the West to Asia, the structural fundamentals of African economies remained the same. In fact, dependency on primary commodity production and exports increased, while manufacturing fell from 21% in the 1970s to 7% in 2012. Thus, industrialization and raising the value chains of African economies remains a pressing imperative. A key development in the contemporary world is growing environmental consciousness as the onslaught of extreme weather events increases. It has been galvanized by a scientific consensus, the tireless work of environmental movements, and the renewed international commitments to sustainable Development Goals. African environmentalists have been active in the global environmental movement because of the disproportionate impact of the climate crisis upon the continent's ecosystems. Unfortunately, stubborn pockets of climate change denialists persist. Climate mitigation efforts signed with great fanfare at international jamborees are often not honored. Hence, one of the most heated issues at the COP27 conference held in November 2022 in Egypt centered on establishing a robust loss and finance facility, a kind of global climate reparations fund. By the digitalization of everything, I refer to the increasing convergence of digital, biological, and physical systems through the integrative capabilities of the internet, artificial intelligence, and robotics. It is transforming all aspects of economic and social life, including education. Often called the fourth industrial revolution, it is generating, as with the previous industrial revolutions, winners and losers, and wealth and inequality. Potentially, it represents science, technology, and innovation on steroids. 4 key trends are evident in the global STI landscape. First, the growth of digital technologies has provided developing countries with potential technological leapfrogging opportunities. Second, a global reshuffling is taking place as Asia, led by China, overtakes Europe and North America in several key STI indicators. Third, research has become increasingly internationalized. Fourth, in addition to government, R&D investments by business, firms, intergovernmental agencies, and philanthropic foundations are rising. Africa actively participated in the previous 3 industrial revolutions, but was not a beneficiary as a provider of enslaved human labor and raw materials that produced and reproduced its underdevelopment. Africa must ensure that it benefits from the 4th industrial revolution. This requires, first, raising digital literacy in African educational systems and society. Second, African countries must become producers and not simply consumers of technologies produced elsewhere. Third, they should build digital capacities, including high-performance computing, HPC, essential for big data storage and analytics. In 2017, Africa had 0.2% of global HPC capacity. Big data from African countries is largely stored in the so-called cloud controlled by large global firms. This is the face of 21st century digital imperialism, in which digital platforms owned by the major technological powers are capturing one service industry after another across the world, from transportation to hospitality to health to entertainment. Fourth, they need to vigorously partake in the construction of the global digital governance regime and not be reduced to taking rules crafted in Europe, America, or China. Finally, Africa needs to optimize its benefits from the green mineral boom as it holds large reserves of minerals essential for digitalization and decarbonization by raising the value chain through manufacturing, promoting decent work, and upholding environmental protection. By the demographic reshuffle, I refer to the changing global demographic regimes, patterns of migration, and the related processes of education and work. Africa's centrality in global demographic dynamics will only increase. In 1960, often regarded as the year of African independence, the continent accounted for 9.34% of the world population. 20 years later, it was 10.7%. In 2000, it rose to 13.2% and reached 17.22% by 2020. Currently, about 60% of the African population is below 25 years old. And by 2100, the continent will have the world's youngest population with a median age of 35. In 2050, Africa's population is projected to grow to 2.49 billion, a quarter of the world's population, and expected to rise to 4.28 billion in 2100, or 40%. This is why many contend the 21st century will be an African century. Educating and skilling Africa's youths to reap the demographic dividend is one of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing African countries and is fundamental to the trajectory of this century globally. Managing international migration is a major political issue in many countries and will grow as countries in the global north and China age and the youth population in Africa explodes. In 2020, international migration represented 3.8% of the world population from 2.8% in 2000. Many of the world's international migrants are workers and refugees. There are also huge numbers of internally displaced people. Currently, most Africans migrate to other African countries. In 2020, 23 million migrated within the continent and 11 million out of the continent, of whom 28% went to Europe, 13% to the Middle East, and 6% to North America. The further the destination, the more educated migrants tend to be. 42% of sub-Saharan Africans in the United States in ages 25 and over held a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 33% for both all foreign and US-born adults. The economic, social, and human capitals of Africa's old and new diasporas need to be mobilized vigorously and strategically for Africa's development and repositioning in the world. Already, the new diaspora is Africa's biggest donor. In 2019, it remitted $84.3 billion. But the restructuring of the geopolitical order are referred to shifting global hegemonies, hierarchies, struggles, and changes in the world system. The emerging economies claim a growing share of the world economy. By 2021, the relative shares of the world's GDP of $146.78 trillion in purchasing power parity was 52.42% for the middle-income countries, 46.30% for the high-income, and 1.04% for the low-income. China, which overtook the United States in PP terms in 2016, had the largest GDP of 27.31 trillion compared to the US with 23 trillion. And of course, the US keeps insisting on nominal values, so that it still looks like the biggest economy in the world. This marked the long return of China to a status it had enjoyed before the era of European imperialism as the world's largest economy, and has become the most serious economic and strategic rival for the United States since World War II. Hegemonic rivalries between the two superpowers have intensified over trade, investment, technology, security, and geopolitics, as each seeks to bolster its alliances and win hearts and minds in the global south. The US-China trade war of 2018-2019 ushered the process of decoupling between the two economies and threatened deglobalization. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the United States and Russia renewed their diplomatic offensive in the global south, reminiscent of the Cold War. Many African countries remain wary of becoming pawns in great power rivalries. Memories of Western imperialism and colonialism are deeply embedded. So is disdain for Western hypocrisies and self-serving arrogance, and widespread resentment against America's endless wars, most recently in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the destructive interventions in Libya. It is imperative that Africa's geopolitical interests, for which the Western powers have shown little interest, are paramount. This includes reform of the United Nations Security Council and the international financial institutions, better market access, and support for climate mitigation efforts. As China eclipses the United States in trade and investment in Africa, in 2021, trade between China and Africa reached $254 billion, while for the US, it declined to $64 billion from $142 billion in 2008. Western scholars and politicians have taken to warning African countries of China's nefarious intentions about the dangers of a debt trap and creeping colonialism, as if they are the unblemished custodians of African interests. The warnings betray a demeaning infantilization of Africa. Other regions and countries have even larger trade volumes with China than Africa, namely ASEAN, the European Union, the United States, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, in that order. Yet, nobody says the risk the infection from the Chinese virus of super exploitation or authoritarianism. China-Africa trade relations are as transactional as they are with other regions. Revisioning African universities. Nationalist and developing dreams. Contemporary African higher education institutions are products of multiple histories and traditions, but almost invariably, their missions, values, and purposes reflect the complex demands of African nationalism. The nationalist project sought to achieve what the late Tandika Nkandawire called 5 historic and humanistic tasks: decolonization, nation building, development, democracy, and regional integration. African nationalist leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere had great expectations of African universities, that they must be locally rooted and relevant, as well as globally minded and competitive, produce well-trained graduates, undertake high-quality research that address the pressing challenges of their societies, advance frontiers of knowledge, valorize African knowledges, promote the Pan-Africanist agenda through collaboration, serve as centers of critical thinking, intellectual inquiry, and robust national debate, and cultivate social attitudes and values for informed citizenship. In other words, almost everything we've been talking about over the last 2 days, you can find it in the writings of these founding presidents of Africa. This vision of the role of African universities was widely shared among African intellectuals and the leaders of the mushrooming universities, who sought to overcome the elitism, inaccessibility, Eurocentrism, and limited curricula and ambitions of the colonial universities, as well as forge distinctive identities and mission. They envisioned a developmental university. The economic literature showed that the quality of human capital is a key driver of economic growth and development. This consensus crumbled under the neoliberal gospel of SAPS that came to view higher education in Africa as an expensive and unnecessary public expenditure for the elites, which was far less essential for development and poverty reduction than primary and secondary education. This dubious thesis was based on studies that purportedly showed rates of return for society were much higher for primary education than for higher education. The new inane orthodoxy was later jettisoned following the rise of globalization discourse and the discovery of knowledge economies and societies, which restored the essential developmental role of higher education. Numerous policy reports by the same agencies that had attacked investment in higher education in the 1980s and 1990s spelled out the case for more knowledge-intensive growth based on increased attention and investment in universities. Concerns were increasingly raised that the continent's stock of tertiary level skills was too small. Academic studies on the positive linkages between higher education and development proliferated. They showed the limitations of conventional rate of return studies and how Africa's production was significantly below its production possibility frontier because of low levels of tertiary education. Once again, it became accepted that education and economic growth are mutually reinforcing. Some studies even showed education has a much larger impact on economic growth in African countries than physical capital, and higher levels of education tend to have larger development impacts than lower levels of education. However, this did not translate into increased public funding. Expenditure per student in 33 African countries declined from $6,800 in 1980 to $1,200 in 2002 and $981 several years later. Lack of clarity and agreement about the role of higher education in development at both national and institutional levels persisted. And so in most countries and universities, no effective development model was articulated beyond fancy rhetoric. Expansion of higher education. In most African countries, higher education institutions were established after independence as the colonial extractive economies did not need large numbers of educated labor, and the functionaries of the colonial state despised and feared the educated elite who led the nationalist movements. In 1960, there were only 71 universities across the continent, most of them in South Africa and North Africa. At independence, many countries did not have a single university and boasted of a handful of people with college degrees. In the 1960s alone, 94 new universities were founded. As the new states sought to overcome the debilitating legacies of colonial underdevelopment by expanding education at all levels, which was deemed imperative for the Africanization or indigenization of the civil service, the generation of human capital for socio-economic development, and cultivation of civic values for nation building. Hardly had higher education found its footing when structural adjustment programs were imposed from the turn of the 1980s that devastated higher education. In the 1960s and 1970s, value was placed on the university as a public good, while under the neoliberal regime, it was seen as a private good, and privatization was emphasized, which was reflected in the exponential growth of private universities, privatization of public universities, and growth of other tertiary or post-secondary, private tertiary or post-secondary institutions. The increase of private universities was also a response to accelerating demand from Africa's burgeoning youth populations that could not be met by public institutions, the rising need for skilled labor, and the burgeoning middle-class aspirations, as well as claims for access and equity by underrepresented regions and groups, including women. Further, it arose out of needs by specific groups in society for different types of higher education that promoted their cultural heritage. The rise of Christian and Islamic institutions was an expression of this trend. As African economies recovered from 2000, there was explosive expansion in the number of higher education institutions and student enrollments. In 1999, there were 626 degree-granting higher education institutions. The number rose to 1,852 by 2020, in which private universities outstripped public ones 101 to 749. The number of tertiary institutions, students rose from 6.16 million in 2000 to 16.13 million in 2020. The enrollment ratio increased accordingly, although it remained much lower than other world regions. In 2020, it reached 10% for sub-Saharan Africa and 33% for the Arab states, against a world average of 40%. Female enrollment continued to lag male enrollment. Sub-Saharan Africa had the lowest gender parity index in the world in 2020, followed by the Arab states. Thus, despite remarkable growth, massification has yet to be achieved. It will require huge investments and commitments by all the stakeholders. The expansion of institutions and enrollments has not been matched by the growth in faculty, resources, and facilities, which undermines educational quality, as faculty-student ratios have deteriorated in many countries. Generally, enrollments have tended to rise much faster than qualified faculty can be trained and secured. Under neoliberalism, academic labor was increasingly devalued, so that academic careers became less attractive and increasingly amounted to taking vows of poverty. The inadequacy of graduate programs, even at flagship institutions, compounded the problem. These deficits must be tackled if African universities can deliver on their promises. Managing challenges and reforms. The challenges facing African higher education are well known. I'll focus on two: funding and governance. Financing higher education is a challenge around the world, but it is particularly acute in Africa because of the state of the continent's economies, the exponential growth of enrollments, poor entrepreneurial and philanthropic cultures, lack of effective and coordinated national policies, and weak systems of institutional leadership and financial management. As the crisis of funding universities deepened in the 1980s and 1990s, compounded by SAPS, a series of reforms were undertaken. World Bank data for 27 countries covering the period 1980 to 2021 shows government expenditures on tertiary education in Africa as a percentage of GDP increased in 15 and declined in 12. But everywhere, in terms of expenditures per student, fell because of the rapid growth in student numbers. This was a global trend. Pressures increased to reform funding of higher education among the three main sets of actors: the state, students, and the universities themselves. The menu of measures varied among countries. Some governments introduced education levies, created trust funds for higher education, established agencies to administer grants, borrowed or mobilized funds from bilateral and multilateral partners and financial institutions, launched tax relief measures for imported educational materials and for investors and philanthropic donors, and tightened loan recovery capacities, including installing a graduate tax. They also initiated new financial models, including performance-based budgeting, input-based budgeting, and allocation of resources through performance contracts and competitive funds, in addition to historically based budgeting. The introduction of cost-sharing measures increasingly transferred the financial burden to students and their families. This encompassed the introduction of tuition fees or sharp rises, establishment of dual-track tuition fees for different groups of students, imposition of user charges for services that were previously free or heavily subsidized, reduction in the value of student loans, grants, and other stipends, outsourcing of accommodation and food services to commercial vendors, and the creation of publicly supported and commercial loan schemes, as well as institutionally generated student aid or scholarships and work-study programs. Higher education institutions undertook revenue diversification strategies by raising tuition fees, increasing faculty, contracted research and consultancies, fundraising efforts, creating businesses, enhancing modes of delivery through the expansion of distance and virtual education, introducing fee-based continuing education courses and certificates, investing in the stock market, leasing buildings, facilities, and land, and offering fee-based services on campus. In addition, cost-cutting measures were widely adopted. Despite national variations in funding regimes, the general trend was towards privatization, which had serious implications for education as a public good. University governance and management have become increasingly challenging because of the proliferation and polarization of internal and external stakeholders. In many countries, the governance and management of public universities is undermined by excessive politicization and tribalization of appointments of vice-chancellors, autocratic management styles, excessively intrusive university councils, weak cultures of shared governance and academic freedom, and the bane of corruption. The private universities are often beholden to the repressive and mercantilist injunctions of their proprietors. Tackling these challenges requires the intervention of all key stakeholders. Governments should focus their student aid schemes on those who most need it. Develop innovative taxation policies to fund higher education. Create enabling conditions to encourage the growth of philanthropic donations and facilitate the mobilization of diaspora financial and intellectual resources. Universities can promote financial sustainability by cultivating alternative revenue streams tied to their core capabilities, rather than establishing business that have nothing to do with universities, including butcheries and bars, and strengthening their fundraising systems, creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem, fostering inter-institutional collaborations, building external partnerships with the private sector and other sectors, adopting more sophisticated and transparent budgeting models to ensure efficient utilization of limited resources, and ruthlessly curtailing the cancer of corruption. Leadership appointments must be based on verifiable qualifications, competence, experience, and aptitude, and systems created for leadership development from student leaders to department chairs to college deans to senior management to vice chancellors to members of council. Enhancing knowledge production. Universities are knowledge producing and dissemination institutions, which has several dimensions in terms of institutional values, research, productivity, and social impact. Since colonial times, African higher education institutions, scholars, and artists have been struggling for intellectual decolonization, decentering the epistemic architecture and meta-narratives of the Eurocentric academy and its hegemonic knowledges. It centers on two intellectual maneuvers: deconstructing Western epistemological hegemony and building vibrant African knowledge systems, which requires expanding the quantity and quality of African knowledge production in all branches of knowledge and raising the global presence of African knowledges. In the immediate post-colonial era, Africanization of personnel was a priority, which was soon achieved. More demanding was intellectual Africanization, the epistemological and ontological hierarchies of European and African knowledges in the post-colonial academy. There were spirited debates about the local and global identities of the African university, its domestic relevance and international affiliations, about liberating it from its pervasive colonial, institutional, intellectual, and ideological architecture. But the decolonization project was fraught, partly because of the duality of the African intelligentsia itself, immersed as it is in complex and often ambiguous epistemic identities and interests, rooted in the intercultural connections, linkages, dialogues, transactions, and translations of knowledges between Africa and Euro-America. The struggle for decolonization is about epistemic freedom and cognitive justice, valorizing the knowledges and ways of knowing of all human beings, dismantling the Eurocentric conceits of eternal and exclusive Western self-referential universalism. It must encompass struggles for multiple epistemologies, ontologies, methodologies, perspectives, practices, and languages in pursuit of epistemic pluralism and intellectual hospitality, a radical openness to otherness. Africa's research production and positioning, as we have heard in this conference, in the global knowledge economy remains alarmingly low. African states, intergovernmental agencies, and universities trumpet the importance of STI and have created policies and agencies to promote it, but progress has been limited. According to the 2021 UNESCO World Science Report, Africa's R&D expenditure as a proportion of GDP stood at 0.59% compared to a world average of 1.79%. In 2018, the continent's share of the global expenditure R&D of 1.77 trillion was a mere 1.01%, the same as in 2014, compared to Asia's 45.72%, the highest in the world. Further, in 2018, Africa had only 280 researchers, 2.5% of the world total, and a ratio of 3.26.4 researchers per million inhabitants, the lowest in the region, while Asia had 969.9 researchers per million inhabitants and accounted for 44.52% of the world's researchers. In terms of scientific publications, in 2019, Asia accounted for 48.01%, while Africa's share was 3.5%, less than Italy with 3.94% or Canada with 3.6%. Africa's record of publications is even lower in the cross-cutting strategic technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, including AI and robotics, biotechnology, energy, materials, nanoscience, and nanotech, and optoelectronics, in which the continent accounted for 3.11% compared to Asia's 60.11%. The only area Africa enjoys dubious distinction is publication with international authors, 55.40% compared to a world average of 23.48%, and Asia's 24.4%. Much of the international collaboration is with countries in the global north, a clear indication of an extreme form of epistemic extraversion that replicates the external dependency of African economies. Not surprisingly, in 2020, Africa accounted for 0.5% of patent applications worldwide and 0.4% of patent grants, compared to Asia's 66.6% and 58.1% respectively. This data underscores Asia's exponential rise in the global knowledge economy, the relative decline of Euro-America, and Africa's continued marginalization. Africa's low performance can be attributed to several factors. First, poor alignment of SDI policies to the prevailing needs of society and national development plans and lack of coordination. Second, inadequate and unstable public funding and low levels, sometimes non-existent levels of private sector investment in R&D. Third, poor SDI infrastructures. Fourth, unsatisfactory scientific literacy and advocacy for popularizing SDI in society. Developing highly productive and impactful research knowledge systems requires massive funding, strong research infrastructures, and publishing, dissemination, and translation capacities. It is imperative to create vigorous interdisciplinary collaborations within universities that addresses the big challenges facing society. Vibrant research reward systems and intellectual property policies and knowledge ecosystems that align university institutions and associations, research organizations and networks, and the assorted collection of think tanks and consultancies, international and intergovernmental agencies, and non-governmental organizations that often translate scientific knowledges into policy, practice, and public discourse. It is also essential to forge effective inter-institutional networks at national, regional, and international levels, especially within Africa itself, the Global South, and the African academic diasporas that should be mobilized systematically as a source of what I call intellectual remittances. Finally, the futures of universities. Emerging out of the COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed and exacerbated the structural deficiencies and dysfunctions of higher education and other sectors, universities need to take stock of their experiences as they refashion their futures. It is a brave new era that demands and will reward institutional resilience, innovation, and flexibility. Debate centers around the competing axes of restoration of the pre-pandemic past, reforms based on lessons learned, or transformation to future profit. A more demanding and comprehensive value proposition of higher education must supplant the conventional telos and institutional resilience fortified. During the pandemic, universities sought to continue providing teaching and learning, producing research and scholarship, promoting impactful engagements with society, and serving as hubs of innovation and entrepreneurship. Of course, some institutions managed the pandemic better than others. The multiple crises exposed by the pandemic compel universities to adopt a fifth mission, what I call the duty of care, internally to their own constituencies and externally to their various stakeholders and society. The pandemic brought to the fore the question of student, staff, and faculty well-being. In the post-COVID-19 academy, mental health must be put on the top of institutional agendas. The duty of care is fundamentally about social justice. So, it must encompass the promotion of humanistic and ecological values for the sustainability of our society's humanity and nature. The pandemic underscored the imperative of building institutional resilience, which entails the ability to withstand and rebound from difficulties and adaptability to new contexts. Reinforcing the resilience of our education institutions requires engaging in scenario and contingency planning, creating emergency reserves, setting up chain of command during emergencies, maintaining effective internal and external communication, strengthening IT infrastructure, and establishing robust mental health services. The pandemic threw into sharp relief three critical dimensions of institutional resilience: finances, leadership, and cultures. Institutions that best navigated the pandemic enjoyed strong financial models and financial literacy among their stakeholders, exhibited collaborative, cohesive, communicative, transparent, and trusting cultures, and were led by leaders who displayed financial acuity, crisis management skills, entrepreneurial and innovative mindsets, technological deftness, multi-genre communication skills, intercultural competence, political savviness, empathy and respect for all constituencies, high emotional intelligence and agility, flexibility, capacity to learn, resilience, moral compass, and accountability. During the pandemic, universities were forced to undertake technological adaptations that seemed destined to hasten changes in learning, research, and institutional operations. The VC shared with us some of those. There are heated debates among academics, consultancy firms, and educational groups about the role of digital technologies in teaching and learning to prepare students for the demands and opportunities of the 21st century. Possibilities were opened for multiple modalities of face-to-face, online, and hybrid learning. However, the pandemic revealed the unequal distribution of digital literacy, devices, platforms, and bandwidth within and among countries, institutions, and students. UNESCO rightly warns against what it calls platform imperialism, in the exclusion of underprivileged groups, the primacy of the logic of business, the redefinition of the social by digitality, and privileging of numerical data sets over other types of data, knowledges, and quantitative narratives. A critical issue for higher education institutions as we emerge from the pandemic concerns curricular design and instruction. Higher education institutions have a responsibility to raise society's awareness and understanding and inform public policy on pressing local and global challenges, create practices in their own institutions that promote the global commons through solidarity and cooperation based on the principles of non-discrimination, equality of opportunity, and social justice that encompasses ecological justice, and effectively harness scientific discoveries for public good. Students must be prepared to live in a rapidly changing world, to become change agents and lead productive and positive lives. The new social contract for education must advance pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity. This entails learning that is collaborative and participatory, problem-oriented and experiential, promotes interdisciplinary, intergenerational, intercultural, international, and informational competences, and treasures and sustains diversity, pluralism, and inclusion. In a crisis-ridden world, full of unknown and evolving circumstances, students must be exposed to and master disciplinary knowledge, interdisciplinary knowledge, procedural knowledge, and the application of knowledge, for which they need cognitive and metacognitive skills, social and emotional skills, and practical and physical skills. They must develop what some call transformative competences. For research, UNESCO has proposed open science as a key aspect of a new social contract for higher education, which has been discussed profitably at this conference. Building a global knowledge commons also requires rethinking internationalization by replacing hierarchical and equal and asymmetrical partnerships with those based on co-ownership and co-creation, mutual benefits and accountability, consortia, and networking. The issue is not about raising Africa's historically dependent internationalization that would only reinforce its epistemic marginalization, but promoting transformative internationalization to bolster its epistemic recentering. The pandemic brought out several issues critical for research agendas of the post-pandemic academy. 5 stand out. First, the imperative of robust investments in research capabilities that focus on solving pressing problems and crises. Second, the necessity of institutionalizing effective interdisciplinary, interprofessional, and transnational collaborations and interventions. Third, the importance of collaboration among research universities, organizations, and networks, policymakers, and international and intergovernmental agencies, as well as industry. Fourth, the vaccine apartheid, so cruelly exposed by the pandemic, underscores the critical importance of research ethics in institutional, interinstitutional, and international engagements and exchanges, which should be undergirded more by the generative principles of open science than by the prevalent, commodified, proprietary, paternalistic, transactional, and exploitative relationships. Fifth, the multiple crises exposed or engendered by the pandemic raised serious issues about scientific productivity, practices, impact, power, and rankings that sanctify global academic capitalism. Moments of crisis are opportune for re-examining the past and reimagining the future. Scenarios of the post-pandemic 21st century academy are being drawn by individual scholars and institutions, as well as by consultancy firms and national, regional, and international organizations. One example is the scenarios developed by the OECD, four for the higher education sector and 6 for universities. The 4 scenarios include institutions operating in networks, institutions focused on serving local communities, institutions pursuing new public responsibilities, and the development of what they call Higher Ed Inc. The 6 scenarios for universities include the traditional university, catering to the elite, the development of entrepreneurial universities catering to the masses, emergence of a dominant private tertiary sector, the scaling up of lifelong learning and open education, and the emergence of a global network of institutions in which university studies become demand and mostly market-driven, and learners define their own course of study. And then the final one is they envisage the disappearance of universities as qualification benchmarks spread to many more sectors. African educators and policymakers must vigorously participate in re-envisioning the future of universities to ensure they are not condemned to borrowing models from elsewhere that do not promote their fundamental interests. This is essential to reclaiming the 21st century as truly ours. In a way, the previous few centuries since the emergence of the modern world system have not been. It is a struggle that is simultaneously economic, existential, and epistemic. Thank you.
Professor Tiboho Moja, who is the department chair at New York University and also doubles up as a senior fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at, of course, you know where, University of Pretoria. Where else, you know? Tiboho is a very experienced professor, widely published, but also has advised at ministerial level in South Africa and elsewhere. So, not to belabor her very long CV, could you join us here and make a comment on Professor Zeleza's presentation? Ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you the cocktail is brewing and it's about ready for consumption. So just be patient. Over to you. Yeah, no, I think you can speak from there if you want because you are wired, aren't you? No?
Yes, I'm wired.
Yeah, you can sit here.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm wired. I need my cocktail first.
Dan, where are you going? The cocktail is happening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm standing between you and the cocktail, but no free lunch, no free cocktail. So let's end it somehow. Well, I just want to thank Professor Zeleza for your comprehensive analysis of the complex and contradictory development challenges that Africa faces, especially now in the 21st century or so. And listen carefully as we talked about the 5 major forces that are shaping changes that are happening, ranging from social movements to democratization, digitalization, and all these forces that I imagine that are shaping what is going on within our own world at the moment. You also reminded us of the fact that we as Africans need to benefit from the 4th industrial revolution and the green mineral boom, and also touching on what needs to be done. I'm usually amazed at how, being at New York University, when I talk to people about the 4th industrial revolution, most of them don't know what I'm talking about. But what we know, and sadly, is that they will benefit more from it before we benefit from it. We know it, we have it, we're talking about benefiting. What we do next is what's going to be important. You also made strong arguments that Africa must be a player and not a pawn in order to realize its long-deferred Pan-Africanist dream. This Pan-Africanist dream is articulated once more in Agenda 2063. And this was adopted in 2015, which I was appalled, to be honest, when that came up, especially with the targeted date of 2063. And looking at the average age of the people who are adopting it, that by the time we reach it, maybe half of them, if not all, won't be there. 48-year plan. So that's one of our challenges. We need development now, not in 2063. We are already running behind. Having said that, you articulated all those, then pivoted to talking about the role of higher education in navigating the challenges and shaping Africa's future. You talked mainly about the challenges that we face and the fact that we need to re-envision or rethink higher education. When you talked about that, I always cringe. When I hear the word re-envision, rethink, I cringe, and you smile, and I know why you're smiling. Paul and I go a long, long way. In the early 90s, we were also re-envisioning higher education. Today, we're still re-envisioning higher education. When are we going to stop re-envisioning it and actually do it? So we did that, and just a quick anecdote where we were re-envisioning it with Paul and Gerard, who was here earlier on, was a Ford, oh, he's still there? Yeah. Yes. It was a Ford Foundation-funded activity to re-envision higher education. And we're put in this nice room, sort of more like therapy, lights dimmed, music playing, candlelight, and we're told to fall asleep and redream what African higher education should look like. So we lay there listening to music and re-envisioned higher education. And today, at this time, 7 o'clock, we're still re-envisioning it. Maybe we should dim the lights and re-envision it in a different way.
Leave
Also,
that for the cocktail.
okay, we'll leave it for the. And having had that, Paul, you mentioned your forthcoming book is also called Re-envisioning. Can I beg you to change that? You can take my advice or not, but we have had too much of this re-envisioning or so. Because I would argue that for change, we need radical strategies for impact and not keep on rehashing the same things that we have said. I looked at your 5 points that you put on the board there. I've heard them before. It is the same ones, same strategies articulated differently. And I'm always waiting to hear something new. In your presentation, you emphasize the state of higher education. You emphasize the lots of challenges for a vehicle that is meant to play a role in development. You did that more than the vision, even though you talked about the vision. And I'm sure it was a well thought out choice for a lecture entitled Vision for the Future. You talked about the vision a little bit towards the end as a bookend. So I would say, similar to the discussions we had earlier on today, where we talked about the debate on African science, where we explained that we need to be clear on meanings. What do we mean by higher education in Africa? And we need to do that and analyze its contributions fully. The title alone, we're talking about higher education, which is a very broad term in a very big continent to start with. I read somewhere an article that I was reading, looking at something about higher education in South Africa. And the article stated that South Africa has over 4,000 institutions that were very diverse as well. I was taken aback, but how people are even counting what is higher education. So when we talk about that, I imagine we're talking more about universities, even though you talked about higher education. So the numbers come down a little bit. Again, we talk about Africa, which is very big. We are the ones that are quick to criticize others that treat Africa as a monolith. Therefore, I would say we need to guard ourselves from falling into the same pitfalls in our desperate search for solutions also. We as Africans can freely talk about Africa in that way, but we don't allow others. It's the same as in the US, where African Americans or Black can use the N-word, but nobody else is supposed to use it. But that doesn't change the meaning of what it is, just because it's used by you or somebody else or so. I think as we explore what we need to do for higher education to really transform our society, we need to consider and remember that the challenges manifest themselves differently in the diverse and evolving nature of African societies. And we need to address them, taking that into consideration so that we can be specific about what we're talking about rather than express it in very broad terms. Talking about the social movements, the powerful drivers of change, but we need to keep in mind too that those social movements also face their own challenges, the infighting, their own power imbalances and so on, and therefore not assume that they are there to help change the systems or so, but we need to interrogate and analyze their successes, their failures, their complexities, as well as how they drive change on the continent. What is it we can learn from that we can pull from that? Going very quickly on some of the things, you talked about digitalization challenges, again, which also needs to be analyzed and addressed given the digital divide within and between Africa. And I know you are aware of those, but as I say, we get into this sort of slide into just assuming and talking about it like that. And the last one on on what you're talking about, some of those factors that bring about change, you talked about the change in geopolitical order. And for Africa in particular, we need to be looking at the implications of China-Africa relations, which has got both its positive and negative sort of challenges. And looking at what I want to mention with that, with those positive and negative challenges, is that looking through the literature, I'm always struck by the fact that we always see what's written in literature as China-Africa relations or China-Africa whatever, never Africa-China. Where you place the word is political and very important. So where are we sliding to in that? Yes, there are positive things. I won't elaborate on that one now. It's out of this. So I would continue to say, as we consider the role of higher education in shaping the future of Africa, what we talked about in the last 2 days were partnerships and networks, which are central for delivering on development. And you rightly pointed out as well that the great African leaders of the 60s promoted Pan-Africanism agenda that was to be achieved through collaboration. So that's not new. That's something we need to pick on. They envisioned Africa, or they visioned it. We are the one re-envisioning it. They visioned Africa that would collaborate and work together. And yesterday I was impressed by the term that was used by Professor Simone Buitenberg, talking about radical collaboration. That's one of the things I'm taking back with me for this, because there's something in just putting that word, radical collaboration or so. So collaboration has been there before, but let's re-envision it as radical. So through networks, I believe we can bridge the divide between countries for the benefits of the continent and shape Africa's future. But we do have those networks They are working. We need to build on them. We need to encourage them. We have many examples, the ARUAs, the World Bank Centers of Excellence, and so on. And we have seen positive outcomes out of that. We have talked about some data, bibliometric data, that indicate that through international collaboration, there's more productivity, there are more publications coming out, the scientific papers that are being produced are low, but they're growing, numbers are growing. Gerald, you talked about that as well today. So I can see you nodding there, and so on. So I'll conclude, my comments are very short on this, that I would conclude by saying Africa's development is to be considered in the context of the global development agendas. We cannot isolate it from that. And taking from what Thandi said earlier on, just before we broke for tea earlier on, you mentioned a point that I like that said, knowledge produced in Africa provides a unique perspective and insights that can bridge the global knowledge gap. So being aware of that, being aware of the power that we have, that we are bridging that, we then need to work on that, work on our institutions of higher learning, capacitate them, fund them, so that they can play their role for our own development. Thank you.
So if you look at the program there, and you see that it was written that it's going to be a conversation between the three of us. But yesterday, my mother turned 85. But I couldn't talk to her because I was flying until, I landed. Then I could talk to her before she went to bed. Mother has always imparted certain wisdom on me. And Tiboho is my sister. Paul is my brother. Says if this appears a clash between your brother and your sister, you must mediate. So I'm not going to participate in the conversation. I will, over cocktail, I think, mediate between the brother and the sister. But I think, let me end. I think that we should proceed to cocktail, if you agree, my brother. Paul,
I agree fully. Yeah. And I want to thank Teboho for those comments. She's advertising the book because all those issues are dealt with in depth.
Yeah. See, I mediated very well. Ladies and gentlemen, like I said, when I wrote the blurb to Paul's book, the last book, one of the last before the one, I said, Paul Tiyambe Zeleza has written a tour de force. His lecture was a tour de force. And then, when I'm waiting for her book, which I'm also writing a blurb, it's in draft form, a robust response was offered by my sister to that. And I think on that note, it is wise for us. Sure, actually, because I got a WhatsApp, the cocktail has brewed. Please drink your case. So thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much.